Yeah, welcome back, Hegelians or fellow philosophers or people who are very skeptical of Hegel. Uh, we want to read Hegel's Lectures on the History of Philosophy, a very central work that were actually lectures that he held for students. So sometimes we have a certain repetitiveness of the content, and it's one of the texts that, in my mind, is a bit easier to understand, but of course it's still Hegel. So, and I actually present a kind of controversial hypothesis on Hegel. But yesterday I looked into the main editor's preface for that work. And this is a professor that I've already met a couple of times. His name is Walter Jeschke. And Jeschke also says, yeah, the preface sometimes makes some very bold claims. For example, that the history of philosophy should develop in accordance with the categories of the logic, which was another big work of Hegel, where he actually showed or displayed or tried to work out the principles of how the universe, of how our logical categories work, and how, in that sense, also the universe should work. Now, but then Walter Jeschke, in the course of this preface, says, well, but why then does the history of philosophy does not match? And why doesn't Hegel try to make it match? And why doesn't he comment on the fact that it doesn't match? So in the end, he comes up with a different hypothesis that the claims that Hegel makes in the preface are more the goals of philosophy. And I admit, even though I'm a relativist, the goal of philosophy is truth. And if I say, no, everything will always be relative, I don't think that is genuine, because as a genuine relativist, this is a sentence that you cannot utter. And so what I say is that relativism is the second best theory. It's not denying that possibly physics will reveal the inner core of our universe and explain everything with certainty, maybe. So far we don't know. So let's attach to a theory that works with the fact that we don't know. I know that I don't know, you may know this sentence. So let's come to the topic today, and Hegel wants to talk about development in general and how constant development is. And that certainly relates to an insight of Heraclitus. Heraclit, I don't know how you say it in English while preserving the Greek, I don't know. But he says the only constant in life is change. Everything changes, and the only thing that remains is change. That was always already a bit absurd to me. Because how can we say everything changes if nothing exists that the change could be attached to, right? So we say something changes. And Hegel makes similar claims. But I think the point is not to reject the statement, but the point is to see that truths usually come as contradictions. And why do they come as contradictions? Because truths require the labor of the mind. And though this sentence here may be true, it actually produces also the opposite of itself, which is untruth. And we have to unpack it, what is true about. And remember, Hegel also started his lectures on the history of philosophy exactly with a contradiction. And some things never change. I don't know who's Elsa and Anna, I guess from the Disney movie, right? And Heraclitus, am I a joke to you? Yeah, but that's not what I wanted to show. I wanted to show this here. We also know Heraclitus, the idea that no man ever steps in the same river twice. By the way, is this a picture from the Ingmar Bergman movie? I'm not sure. I'm not sure about this picture, maybe. So I found that on a website, right? So no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. And yeah, I mean, we might say, yeah, that may be true, but is that really the whole? Isn't it that we mean by a river more a kind of abstract formation, geological formation in the landscape, and not the concrete material of water in the river? Don't we talk about a universal, same as we talk about man? Now, what Heraclitus here refers to is very much the concrete individual at a certain moment of time, but it certainly kicks out the idea of a universal that is also involved. And I say again, when we deal with phenomena, we never see universals or individuals. We always see particulars. That is a kind of combination of whatever we reconstruct as an abstract universal or as an abstract individual. I claim we've never seen the real individual as much as we have never seen the real universal. Okay, but let's dive into the text. So we talk about the notion of development. The idea of development is well known, but it is the special characteristics of philosophy to investigate such matters as we formerly held as known. So there's something that we don't know about it, right? So we want to dive into it. What is dealt with or made use of without consideration as an add to daily life is certainly the unknown to man unless he be informed in philosophy. The further discussion of this idea belongs to the science of logic. So I already have to stop. What is he saying here? What is dealt? So, okay, we have also things that are an add in our life where we don't really need to dive into, right? And so, and that is the unknown, what is unknown to man. And philosophy tries to dive deeper, but it may not be necessarily related to practical questions. I'm not entirely sure why he says that here. So the logic deals actually with the logical categories that are somehow hidden under our normal way of thinking and under the phenomena of nature that are presented to us in the empirical world, the world that surrounds us. In order to comprehend what development is, so that is what we want to talk about, development, what may be called two different states must be distinguished. The first is known as capacity power, what I call being in itself, potentia. The second principle is that of being for itself, actuality. Okay, so we have here two states. That is a very well-known distinction since Aristotle, and it's better if we look at an example to understand what it is. If we see, for example, that man is by nature rational, we would mean that he has reason only inherently or in embryo. So, okay, we have a man, and we say he is rational. Man in general is rational by his nature, okay? So, and what that means is that he can sleep, but he's still rational, but only potentially rational. Or when he's a child, he's not fully developed, and therefore he's not yet rational, but he has the potential to be rational at some point. So he's not in his act for himself at that very moment rational, but he is just implicitly rational. That should be clear. In this sense, reason, understanding, imagination are possessed from birth or even from the mother's womb. But while the child only has capacities or the actual possibility of reason, it is just the same as if he had no reason. Reason does not yet exist in him since he cannot yet do anything rational and has no rational consciousness. Thus, what man is at first implicitly becomes explicit and is the same with reason. If then man has actuality on whatever side he is actually rational, and now we come to reason. Okay, I think the example is clear, right? We have an implicit capacity of reason that is not always fully explicit. So if we say the world is rational, the world is rational, then it doesn't have to show always at any state its rationality. It could be potentially rational. What is the real meaning of this word? Okay, which word does it mean? I guess rational. That which is in itself must become an object to mankind, must arrive at consciousness, thus becoming for man. So there is something that is just implicit, we call that here in itself, which is just potentially. And this has to develop, it has to come to consciousness, it has to be for consciousness. And it has to come in this sense to reasonability, it has to be recognized by reason. What has become an object to him is the same as what he is in himself through the becoming objective of this implicit meaning. Man first becomes for himself. He is made double, is retained and not changed into another. So here the paradox is, or the contradiction that we have, is that in order to be reasonable, you already have to be reasonable. In order to recognize reason, you already have to have reason. And this is a contradiction, and that is what he says. So when reason has to come an object for him, it is only through the fact that he has reason implicitly in him. So in that sense, man becomes himself, because that's a essential characteristics of ourselves. I mean, now we can argue, no, man is irrational. No. I mean, of course, we are also irrational beings and we just follow our emotions from our psychological side, right? But what is meant here is the fact that we have a capacity to recognize the world. Okay, so, and by that, we double ourselves, okay? We are implicitly reasonable, but now we make reason an object and we actually see ourselves through what we are. I mean, if we go later into the anthropologies of the 20th century, especially Plessner, he would say, yeah, we are not a centered individual. We are, what does he use? Positionality, eccentric positionality. We are out of our middle because we double ourselves. While the animal lives from its center back into its center, man leaves himself and looks at himself. So in this way, it is in thought alone that thought is object, reason produces what is rational. Okay, this is a very central insight. I don't know if I can explain that in the full extent here, but in order to have a starting point for science, you cannot just start with something that is just based on an intuition. It has to be recognized by reason. But if it's recognized by reason and you didn't secure the instrument so that you can make sure that it's really reasonable, it's again just an intuition. So therefore reason has to investigate itself. But because reason is the subject and the same object, it may be able to achieve identity with itself. So therefore in German idealism, reason is often considered as the only source for a stable foundation for sciences. Reason is its own object. And by the way, this is also what the critic of pure reason says, because critique of pure reason means that reason is criticized, but who's criticizing? Well, it's reason. Critique of pure reason. It's the subject and the object. I don't know if you understand that, but that's kind of an interesting interpretation to understand the whole project and why reason is so central for these philosophers. It's not about talking about the psychological condition, but about the possibility of sciences in general. The fact that thought may also descend to what is destitute of reason is a consideration involving wider issues, which do not concern us here. So this is just what I said, right? And I hope it's understandable. But even though man, who in himself is rational, does not first seem to have got further on since he became rational for himself, what is implicit having merely retained itself, the difference is quite enormous. So there's still a difference between my activity of reasoning and the recognition of my reason. No new content has been produced, and yet this form of being for self makes all the difference. Nothing new, we just recognize ourselves, but that's what makes man man and distinguishes him from an animal. Now somebody comes out and says, but chimpanzees, they are very smart, and dogs, and dude, what do you know? Just look into modern science, anthropology. Why do we always have to give ourselves this superposition where we are just better than any other life form? And well, I just say to that, well, if a horse has the same capacity, well, then it's also a man, right? I think Immanuel Kant even says, I don't know where he said that, I just heard it. If my horse had reason, if I discovered that my horse had reason, I had to step down from the horse at that very moment, and I had to start congratulated, or I don't know what he said, but like talking with him or something. So this is not the point. Like it's not like a discussion of certain biological organisms. It's like the capacity for recognizing yourself as a reasonable being and recognize the instruments that you use for all these operations. So the whole variation in the development of the world and history is founded on this difference. This alone explains how, since all mankind is naturally rational and freedom is the hypothesis on which this reason rests, slavery yet has been, and in part still is, maintained by many people, and men have remained contented under it. So why have we suddenly here the idea of freedom? Well, this is a wider discussion, but I think we suddenly involve the idea of freedom because the self-recognition removes man from being just a physical object. It centers him outside of itself. There is a difference. And this difference is not necessarily a freedom of will. It's not necessarily freedom of desires, but it's an exposed position that we obtain here. And I think it's reasonable to start introducing the thought of freedom here. But of course, we need to discuss that on a deeper layer. So, and now he talks about slavery. So why are there still slaves? The only distinction between the Africans and the Asiatics on the one hand and the Greeks, Romans, and moderns on the other is that the latter know, and it is explicit for them that they are free, but the others are so without knowing that they are, and thus without existing being free. Now, I don't know if that applies to our current situation, and of course I don't want to talk about these things so much because there are so many traps that you can walk into where you get like a shitstorm or something. But there are two things that I want to point out here. First of all, Hegel says all humans are the same, right? But they are distinguished by their history because some have not yet walked that path of freedom. Now we can say, oh, this is colonial supremacy that he promotes here. Maybe. But I think he wants to say that the others also should be free. And how can the West dictate the standards for all of these people? Maybe there's another kind of freedom. Or we don't need that freedom. Okay. Let's go on. So this constitutes the enormous difference in their condition. All knowledge and learning, science and even commerce have no other object than to draw out what is inward or implicit and thus to become objective. Okay, so he says this is a general principle of development, as Brandon would say, to make explicit. his famous book from the 90s, making it explicit, right? That's why maybe Brandon feels so drawn to this theory. Because that which is implicit comes into existence, it certainly passes into change, yet it remains one and the same, for the whole process is dominated by it. The plant, for example, so and this is the interesting thing, we have something that changes here, but at the same time, it does not change. And that's the absurd thing that we try to discover here. So the plant, for example, does not lose itself in mere indefinite change. From the germ, so here's another example where he explains it with regard to a plant, right? From the germ, much is produced when at first nothing was to be seen, but the whole of what is brought forth, if not developed, is yet hidden and ideally contained within itself. So yeah, when we have a plant and we just have the germ or the seed, we don't see the plant. But ideally, it's already in this plant. The whole tree is already contained in this plant. And we just need the external conditions to unfold this potential. And this is also interesting about the debate whether an embryo is a human being. I mean, it's already a faux pas to say nowadays that you're not clear on the abortion debate. What? Why can't you be for a woman deciding for her freedom what she is? And I'm like, hold on. I'm like, I don't want to say to women what they have to do, right? I just have a question about what is the status of an embryo. And for me, it's not so easy to just say it's a heap of cells. The moral decision is way more complicated, and I'm glad that I'm not in the position to make that moral decision. It's the ease of man that they don't have to make that decision. And maybe you make it at the same time too easy for them. I don't know. The principle of this projection into existence is that the germ cannot remain merely implicit, but is impelled towards development, since it presents the contradiction of being only implicit and yet not desiring so to be. So yeah, there's an, I don't know how that is actually expressed in German, but there's an inclination towards that development. And now again, we have here a contradiction. It presents the contradiction of being only implicit and yet not desiring so to be. I don't understand this. The principle of this projection into existence is that the germ cannot remain merely implicit, but is impelled. Okay, that is clear. And then he gives a reason for that. Or there's a contradiction in being only implicit and yet not desiring so to be. Okay, so what he says here is that when something has the potential, then it must also desire actuality. Otherwise, we would never say that the potential is there. Then it wouldn't be a potential. Now, this is a very hard thought to grasp that is not immediately intuitive to me. But let's say we had a germ, but the germ would not try to develop into a plant. If that desire wouldn't be there, then even if the external conditions would be fulfilled, it would never develop into a plant, and therefore we could not talk about having that kind of potential, right? But this coming without itself has an end in view. So there's an end that is seemingly installed in the plant. Its completion fully reached, and its previously determined end is the fruit or produce of the germ, which causes a return to the first condition. Yeah, this is a speciality of life, that the goal of life is to produce itself again. So its end is to become what it is. And this is also what reason is, right? It's implicit, but its end is to become what it is. The germ will produce itself alone and manifest what is contained in it, so that it then may return to itself once more, thus to renew the unity from which it started. With nature, and here the important word is unity, I think the rest is quite clear. With nature, it certainly is true that the subject which commenced and the matter which forms the end are two separate units, as in the case of seed and fruit. So here we have a separation of the form and the content, of what develops and the content becomes. I think what he wants to say with reason, it is truly an identity. But in this year, we still have a difference, because the subject puts forth an object, but the object is not itself the subject as much as it is in reason. I assume, I may be wrong on that. The doubling process has apparently the effect of separating into two things that which in content is the same. Thus, in animal life, the parent and the younger are different individuals, although their nature is the same. So their nature is the same, but like the individuals are different. I wonder how that is for man. Can we actually finish that? I'm running a bit short on time. Well, today we have a longer session, I guess. So in mind, it is otherwise. It is, okay, here we say, okay, for the animals, we have the parents and the offspring, which are different individuals, but they are unified in nature. But now he says in mind, it is different, okay? So we wonder, how is it in mind? It is consciousness, and therefore it is free. So here's what I have said before. We don't know what the freedom means here yet, and maybe he explains that now. Uniting in itself the beginning and the end. So it seems the freedom means that the beginning of the process of recognizing itself as reason and the end being reason are a unity, and that is what is freedom. As with the German nature, again, a comparison, mind indeed resolves itself back into the unity after constituting itself another. Okay? So here man recognizes himself, he doubles himself, but it's not two individuals suddenly, right? In nature we have two individuals. So, but somehow it resembles nature because there is a unity established. But what is in itself, so the implicit thing, right, becomes for mind and thus arrives at being for itself. So the mind that is implicit has the potential to become explicit for himself and thus become itself. So this is the difference. The fruit and seed newly contained within it, on the other hand, do not become for the original germ, but for us alone. So yeah, if we have the plant and it produces its offspring, it does not become for the original germ. It becomes for itself, again, another plant, another individual. In the case of mind, both factors not only are implicitly the same in character, but there is a being for the other and at the same time a being for self. So we have here the production of itself and the being for itself. I hope these terms are clear now. That for which the other is, that which I produce, is the same as the other. So I'm the other that I'm producing, right? I'm producing myself as another. I'm looking at myself as another. I divide myself from subject into object. So there's a difference, but at the same time there's a preserved unity. It's a unity of unity and difference, as the slogan of idealism often is said. The development of mind lies in the fact that it's going forth and separation constitutes its coming to itself. So that which actually separates itself from itself is at the same time it's coming back to itself. Filled with contradictions. That's what Hegelian philosophy is all about. This being at home with itself, so now we are at home with ourselves in the way that we leave ourselves, or coming to self of mind may be described as its complete and highest end. It is this alone that it desires and nothing else. Yeah, like desire has a very central importance for Hegel, but of course the desire is later lifted up in this relationship of self-consciousness. But this is a little bit more complicated thought that he will discuss in the Phenomenology of Spirit, which, by the way, I will also read, but that's probably a project of 10 years or so. Everything that from eternity has happened in heaven and earth, the life of God and all the deeds of time simply are the struggles for mind to know itself, to make itself objective to itself, to find itself, be for itself, and finally unite itself to itself. It is alienated and divided, but only so as to be able thus to find itself and return to itself. So this is the principle of the known universe. Let's call it the known universe because I'm a relativist. Does he claim that this is like the true principle of mind external nature? I don't think he claims that. I think he claims that all the nature we know follows this principle. But what else in nature can we find than reason if our only instrument to recognize nature is reason? So it's a mind internal experiment that he's conducting here, and he's working out the framework. Only in this manner does mind attain its freedom, for that is free which is not connected with or dependent on another. So here we have a definition of freedom. It means it is free if it's not connected with or dependent on another. That means if reason can come to itself and know itself, then it has truth, and this truth is its freedom, that it makes itself free from the external forces of nature and so on and so forth. So this identity is the core idea that constitutes freedom. Of course, we are not just transcendental beings who live beyond the world as this kind of freedom, but we have to go through these stages to at least establish this kind of aim. That's our goal within the nature that we recognize around us. I think that's a clever thought, but it's hard to interpret Hegel here in a relativist way. There is definitely a clear track to a very rigid philosophy that says, no, this is the truth, okay? This is the mind external truth. True self-possession and satisfaction are only to be found in this, and in nothing else but thought does mind attain this freedom. So he says, okay, do we know anything else where freedom could be established? And this is a really scientific question. Where do we find the starting point of science, if not in our minds? In sense perception, for instance, and in feeling, I find myself confined and am not free. So he gives now examples where we are not free. But I am free when I have a consciousness of this, my feeling. So let me just finish here. Let me read these last sentences and then we finish. Man has particular ends and interests even in will. I am free indeed when this is mine. So I make this mine, right? Then I'm free, even when I have will. And if I have interests, if I can possess them as my interests and make them transparent to myself, I can be free. That's what he says here. But how do we do that? That's a more complicated question. Such ends, however, always contain another, or something which constitutes for me another, such as desire and impulse. It is in thought alone that all foreign matter disappears from view, and that matter is absolutely free. All interest which is contained in the idea and in philosophy is expressed in it. Whew, complicated stuff. So what do you think? Is this all reasonable? Don't shy away from your answers. Don't make the mistake and just say nothing. It's important that we discuss these topics. We are moving on to discuss it. By the way, like what came to my mind is really the question, like, can man free himself from this coat of flesh and become a artificial intelligence, and how would that change the truths that Hegel has here expressed? I don't think much, but what is your position on that? Do you think that this idea of freedom is reasonable and that it goes along with current insights of our research? Well, let me know in the comment. If the question is too complicated, let me know it was too complicated. I'm sorry, make it easier. And yeah, if you want to follow Hegel further, I think it can benefit a lot your intellectual life, then subscribe and let's keep a thriving discussion. And let's keep in contact. Thank you very much. See you soon.